Al, you're leading this major research project, Big Questions in Free Will. First thing people might ask is, why is there a problem? Everybody knows what free will is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, why is there a problem about free will? Well, if you just read what's out there in the literature, sometimes in the popular press, there are people claiming that it's obvious that there's no free will, that it's an illusion, a myth. Sometimes you hear, well, how could there not be free will? It's obvious that there is. So when you have that radical disagreement about something, you wonder, well, maybe part of the problem is people use the word in very different ways.
But in fact, in the philosophical literature, in the science community, there are very deep issues about free will. In fact, it's indeed very probative of deep things about the nature of the physical universe, about the nature of consciousness. So it really is one of the great questions in philosophy.
It is. It's a great old question. It used to be framed in terms of free will and determinism, where determinism is the idea that if you take a complete description of the universe at any point in time and conjoin it with a complete list of all the laws of nature, you get something that entails all truths about the future, including everything that everybody would ever do. And because free will and determinism were paired long ago, people still tend to talk in those terms as though they're necessarily opposed. One major movement in free will literature and philosophy is to deny that there's any sort of essential opposition between free will and determinism. That worry about determinism, you could see as a worry about how human decisions are caused. And the neuroscience wing of the project is looking into that. It's looking into what goes on in the brain when people make decisions.
So given that nature of the problem, how does your research project attack it? I mean, this seems like very abstract, philosophical, a lot of fun, but it doesn't seem like something that research can make progress on. This is really a pioneering effort.
Okay, yeah, let me explain how the different dimensions of the project dovetail. So in the science wing, we mainly have neuroscientists and social and cognitive psychologists. And the neuroscientists tend to look at what goes on in the brain when people make decisions. The more we learn about the process of decision making, the better position we might be in to determine whether decision making is sometimes free, usually not free, or whatever. There are different possibilities. In the social psychology wing, we have some investigations of effects of people's beliefs about free will on their behavior. And I might mention just one study, just to give you an example of this sort of thing. So it was done by Kathleen Voss and Jonathan Schooler. And what they did was to divide subjects into 3 groups. And one group read a passage by a scientist saying there's no free will. A second group read passages saying there is free will. And a third group read neutral passages. And then they took, supposedly, a math quiz. And they were told, the program is glitchy, so if you don't press the space bar right after the question shows up, then the answer is going to show up. And of course, if the answer showed up, then they could cheat. Okay. So what happened is that the people who read the no free will passage cheated significantly more often than the other 2 groups. And the people who read the neutral passage and the people who read the pro free will passage behaved about the same, which indicates that the belief in free will is a sort of default belief. You get it in both of those other 2 groups. I can tell you about more studies like this, but we should probably move on. So now, if it comes out in the news that people don't have any free will, and the journalist means one thing by free will, and the readers mean something else, then there's a kind of miscommunication. And it could be that what the journalist thinks is free will is something way more exalted than what ordinary people think is free will. And so one thing that we're studying, really, is just how do ordinary people think about free will? And this is being done by some of the social psychologists and some of the philosophers who do experimental philosophy. I can tell you about a little study of mine that I did, a little experimental philosophy study. This isn't the main sort of thing that I do, and really it would need some background to see what's going on, so I'm going to give you a little background and then we'll do it. Okay. So some of the neuroscientists who are doing really good neuroscientific work claim that free will requires immaterial souls or minds. Okay. Now, this is not a scientific discovery. It's not as though you do neuroscience and by doing it discover that the expression free will means something that includes souls or minds. Right? That's a question about meaning. It's not a question about how the brain works. So some claim free will requires immaterial souls, immaterial minds, and then, you know, they've got lots of evidence that the brain is heavily involved in everything we do, and so they say, well, look, there can't be any free will. Now, as I myself use the expression free will, it does not require immaterial souls or minds, and so I wonder, how about ordinary people? So here's a simple study I did. This is actually one part of a four-part study. But I wrote out a very short story for subjects, and it went like this. In a certain year, scientists discover, this is a year in the future, scientists discover that there's nothing non-physical, that everything is physical. They discover that all decisions are brain processes that are caused by other brain processes. John Jones is walking down the street. He sees a $20 bill fall out of the person in front of him. He thinks about whether to return it. He decides to keep it. Of course, his decisions were brain processes, and they were caused by other brain processes, and there's nothing non-physical. Question, did John Jones have free will at the time? And 73% of people say yes. Okay, so we have, on the one hand, some neuroscientists claiming that the meaning of free will includes immaterial souls. We have the effect of the no free will news on the general public, which we can sort of predict based on the studies we've seen. And then we have now findings about what layfolk mean by free will. So one thing that I'd like to see happen, because all three of these groups are going to be present at three different conferences, is that the exchange among them generates more sophisticated thinking about what free will means. Okay, so there are three different branches to the project. There's a science of free will branch, and that includes neuroscientists, social psychologists, and philosophers. Mm-hmm. There's what we call the conceptual underpinnings of free will branch, and that is philosophers. And then there's the theology of free will branch, and that competition is open to philosophers and theologians.
So let's describe each one of them. In the science branch, who are the different scientists, the different categories, the different disciplines?
Well, the different disciplines are neuroscience. Mm-hmm. There are several neuroscience projects, social psychology, and cognitive psychology.
What are each one trying to address?
The neuroscientists are mainly studying in broad strokes what goes on in the brain when people make decisions, but also things like what it feels like to make a decision, what it feels like to act, and so on. So they're looking at something that's connected to free will, because free will is usually tied conceptually anyway to decision making. Maybe some decisions are free, others are unfree. The social psychologists are studying things like the effect of people's beliefs on their behavior, beliefs about free will on their behavior, willpower, what that's like, and also trying to figure out what lay folks mean by the expression free will, how they use the word free will, how it's connected to the way they think about moral responsibility, and so So in broad strokes, that's what the science folks are up to. The philosophy projects are relatively technical projects on free will. We have funded one round. There's another round of grant competition coming up.
What are the questions you're trying to address?
Well, and again, these questions are selected by the authors of the grant proposals. But so one is, what does physics have to do with free will? Another is, can we freely refrain from doing things, and how similar or different is that from freely doing a thing? Questions of that kind. And then the theological part of the grant deals mainly with questions about divine freedom, but also with questions about the bearing of God, if God exists or is possible, on human freedom. The questions about divine freedom are interesting. For example, if God is perfect, can he do anything other than what's best? But if he can't do anything other than what's best, then how can he be free? Questions about God's connection to human beings. If God exists and is omniscient and knows in advance everything that we'll ever do, how could we possibly do it freely? So these are really old chestnut questions.
And each of these categories are fascinating in their own right, and heretofore have had no communication among each other. They've been really isolated views of the world, even though they have sort of a free will concept. The neuroscience, philosophical underpinnings, the social science in terms of attitudes or beliefs, and certainly the theology. So do you feel there's a real opportunity by bringing these different total ways of thinking together?
Yes, I do. And lately, in the last few years, scientists and philosophers have been working to some degree in teams. We're encouraging a lot more of that. So the science grant teams include quite a few philosophers. Actually, about almost a third of them are philosophers. Yeah, one advantage, really, of bringing the different groups together is that the expression free will means different things to different people. And actually, in different disciplines, different meanings tend to be prominent. So one thing we're studying is what free will means to lay people. And I think knowledge about that may have an effect on how others, professionals, say, use the expression free will. I mean, suppose somebody discovers that the way he or she uses it is in line with only 15% of the general public, 85% are opposed, they use it differently. Well, that person might think twice about why he or she means by free will what he or she means by it. And philosophers, depending on the kind of philosophy they do, can benefit from the scientific work. So, for example, there's a view of free will according to which when you act freely, you could have done otherwise at that very time. And that would mean that the brain would have to work in a way that gives you these alternative possibilities. And then what you'd want to know in the end, in the long run, is, does the brain work that way? Does it work in a way that leaves open, right at the moment of decision, different possible decisions? Or are those doors closed by the time we get very close to decision making? Those are interesting questions that over time we might learn something about.